Hello and welcome to Ekphrasis. My name is Sailor St. Clair. I am the co-artistic director of Novelties Theatre, and I'm here today chatting with Jacqueline Boxx about Gothic novels and trapped heroines. Jacqueline is on a mission to make disability visible on the burlesque stage and beyond. She is actually the first person to compete in a wheelchair for a title at the Burlesque Hall of Fame competition. Her work as a performing artist is inspired by her disability and experiences with chronic pain. And she's also an advocate for accessible teaching practices and performance spaces throughout the dance world. And recently, she just told me that podcaster Justin McElroy referred to her as totally unhinged. So with that, welcome, Jacqueline. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm happy to hear more about how this question of being totally unhinged might fit in with the Gothic. So normally on Ekphrasis, we ask our guests why this book, but we're not really talking about a book today. We're talking about a genre of literature and some tropes within it. So can you tell me why the Gothic novel? Why are you so interested in this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the Gothic. I was initially drawn to Romanticism as a genre, like the British Romantics, because they are sort of the period that comes right after the French Revolution. There was all of this optimism and idealism, hope for the outcome of a rebellion. And then in the Romantic period, authors and artists began to see the flaws, the beginning of the dissolution of those dreams and those ideals. And then the Gothic really focuses in on the wreckage of dreams, the wreckage of ideals. At the same time, though, there's this beauty, right? There's beauty in the wreckage and in the ruin. So in medieval romance, you had this beautiful castle. In the Romantic period, it is starting to be taken over by nature, starting to crumble. And then in the Gothic, you have the ruined castle that is in shattered pieces. But there's still beauty there. So I'm obsessed with that kind of progression, but then also the idea of finding beauty in damaged idealism.
We often associate the Gothic with horror, but the Gothic tradition is marked primarily by setting and style. Gothic novels of the 19th century expand from the Romantic tradition in their emphasis on the emotional world of their characters and a stylistic obsession with the medieval past. Hallmarks of horror are also part of the Gothic tradition, which delights in catacombs, ruins, boneyards, and other specters of death and decay that encourage readers to experience both wonder and terror simultaneously. Classic works of Gothic fiction include Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto and Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. Scholars Laura R. Kreml, Catherine Pugh, and Dawn Staubert even argue that post-apocalyptic fiction, like Josh Malerman's Bird Box, or films such as Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror or George Miller's Mad Max Fury Road, also continue the Gothic tradition through environmental estrangement.
So in thinking about the space of the Gothic, you described this progression from the castle to its being reclaimed by nature to its eventual decay in the Gothic period. And so the piece that you've created for us today is based on this trope from Gothic literature about heroines being trapped in these spaces. So can you tell us a little bit more maybe about how that idea of decay speaks to this conceit of entrapment?
Absolutely. The Gothic heroine is frequently within Gothic novels confined in particularly domestic spaces. This is something that we see over and over again with women who are trapped in their bedrooms. They're trapped in a tower. They're confined in a scary house, right? The spooky manor that they are haunting the wings of. These are all essentially domestic spaces. And over and over again in the Gothic, you see women kind of dealing with threats that are coming from inside the house that are representative of the house, whether it's another member of the household, or it's a ghost that is haunting the walls of the house. This feeling of being trapped inside a particularly domestic space is really powerful, and I think really indicative of the ways in which the Gothic is progressive in its views, because the struggle of women to break away from those domestic spaces and to feel safe, to finally locate their own kind of freedom. That's the whole struggle of these Gothic heroines. And I particularly obviously connect with that through a number of different lenses, both as a disabled woman who spends a huge amount of time at home, and also as somebody who is surviving a pandemic that has many of us in quarantine.
Yeah, I think we all feel a little bit trapped by our homes. At some point early in the pandemic, I would refer to the phase where I was painting or actually reconstructing my walls in the house, learning how to do drywall and stuff. I refer to that as the yellow wallpaper phase, which is not a Gothic, but right, when you're speaking about these themes, these tropes of women being trapped in these confined spaces, that comes up to me. So in that late Victorian era as well, right? So this seed of the Gothic really travels through and germinates a lot of other literary periods. So will you maybe tell us a little bit more about your work as a disabled artist and what you've done here in the piece you're going to show us today that works through this trope?
Yeah, so one of my goals as a disabled artist is to represent my experience authentically, which isn't to say that I speak for, large numbers of disabled people or consider myself a spokesperson. I actually want the very opposite of that. I want to be seen as an artist who is representing my unique viewpoint, which includes disability. And at the same time, I want to try to rewrite some of the very typical narratives that we see of disability so that audiences are able to see a full spectrum of what it is like to live with a disability. So I'd say that the typical structure of a story about disability, a general narrative, is about how disability is confining, right? There's that very standard phrase, which makes my skin crawl, confined to a wheelchair, which is an inaccurate phrase because, as many disabled people put it, a wheelchair represents freedom. It means that you can move, you can leave the home, you can access the world beyond, and you can access your life fully. You have that kind of freedom. So a wheelchair is not confining. There's also the kind of strange ableist inner assumption that people who are confined to a wheelchair very, very rarely ever leave their wheelchair, which is also entirely false. Often people in wheelchairs are mobile to some extent. A wheelchair is simply something that helps them to live their life in a safe way. So all of this is to say that confinement versus freedom is very much linked into how society views disability generally. And since the usual narrative is one of confinement, I thought it would be interesting or important to represent the other side of that, of mobility aids as freedom, as releasing from confinement.
That's really great. I like the way that you phrased so much of that, and it reminded me of the movement within the disability community and sort of the international sign community, by which I don't mean sign language, I mean like the people who literally make signs, to change I'm sure they have a name, I just don't know what it is, to change the symbol that we use to represent disability in the world from that static upright wheelchair to that more active forward moving symbol so that the international symbol for access then actually looks like it's representing some kind of movement and accessibility in the world rather than this more like static medical model. So in your work, I want to ask a little bit more about how this relates to some of the specific novels. So when you read some of the Gothic literature that you love so much, do you bring a disability lens when you read that? Are there passages in these novels that remind you of the kind of situations you were just describing? Or are there other lenses that you bring to reading these pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many wonderful passages in Gothic novels that address the sublime. And I am obsessed with the sublime. I think that when I got married, my entire sermon was pretty much about the sublime and about how the sublime is the true depth of love. The sublime is often opposed with the beautiful. When we think about the beautiful, we think of something that is pleasing and soothing to the senses, something that brings with it a sense of calm pleasure. Whereas the sublime is something that brings us to the edge of ourselves, that clutches at our guts. People say that an experience where you would, quote unquote, see God, that would be sublime, a situation where it's almost painful, but at the same time is wondrous, awe-inspiring, awful in the awe sense. And that's something that runs throughout the descriptions of both emotions and the landscape in Gothic novels. Things are often described as sublime, like viewpoints onto horrible, craggy mountains that you are imagining you could fall off of to your death. But also the inner world is described in sublime terms. For me, the sublime connects to disability because I feel like my experience with disability personally brings me to the edge of myself very often. I am teetering on this edge between joy that this is who I am and terror and horror. All of those things are combined in my personal experience with my body. There's intense love and there's intense fear. All of that is wrapped up in what it means to be disabled in my body for me. There's one passage from the Mysteries of Udolpho, which was one of the texts that I specifically was reading while creating this act. It's a description of the sublime. The protagonist is Emily St. Aubert. She is confined in a castle, Udolpho, in the mountains. And she's constantly being pulled in different directions by her emotions. It's very much a novel about a woman who is trying to decide which of her emotions are rational and which ones she must conquer in order to win the day. At one point, she comes across a veiled portrait. This is my favorite thing in the novel. She goes into a gallery and there's a portrait that has a veil hanging over it. And she is desperately drawn to pull the veil back. She cannot stop herself from doing it. She's terrified, but she has to do it. When she pulls it back, you never actually get the description in the book of what she sees. She just is hit with such an intensity of emotion, of sublime emotion, that she cannot speak about it. And the reader, therefore, never gets to learn about it. So this is a description where she's talking about her kind of, her memory of pulling away this veil. As she passed through the chambers that led to this, she found herself somewhat agitated. its connection with the late lady of the castle and the conversation of Annette, together with the circumstance of the veil, throwing a mystery over the subject that excited a faint degree of terror. But a terror of this nature, as it occupies and expands the mind and elevates it to high expectation, is purely sublime and leads us by a kind of fascination to seek even the object from which we appear to shrink. I think that's a lovely kind of in-depth description of what the sublime really feels like. Something that terrifies us, but that draws us in. I think that for people outside of disability, there is an element of that as well. People are drawn to things which they fear, such as disability, illness, death. These are things that terrify the able-bodied. But at the same time, they can't stop looking. They can't stop wanting to know more. I'm not as much interested in that as I am interested in the experience of a disabled person from the inside. And my experience with my own body is such that I am alternately like drawn to it, confused by it, scared of it, in love with it. But I am I never want to turn away from exploring my body and exploring its relationship to itself.
Thank you so much for that reading of Udolpho and your connection to the sublime and your own embodiment. I think that it's a really compelling way to read yourself, right, and your own experience. And it also acknowledges that states of ability are often in flux, right? There are days that you are probably feeling much better than other days. And that seems to me also in the vein of that experience of the sublime. But I was also thinking about that passage and the way that we often feel when we view art, right? Like one reading that is through perhaps a different lens of that moment, right? She can't describe it to us because none of us experience looking at a piece of art in the same way, right? And that's part of the conversation that we have when we're talking about books, right? None of us read it exactly the same way. So your understanding of the sublime through your perspective as a disabled person differs so much from the way an able-bodied reader might approach that same reading, right? Like, which I think you pointed out really beautifully. Are there any other passages that you wanted to share? I realize that you have books and you have prepared because you are you. Yes. So please, if there are any other passages that you wanted to share that speak to the piece that you've created, we can do that. And then we will show the viewers what you've been working on.
Yeah. The other text that was particularly influential to me was Wuthering Heights, which is one of my favorite novels ever. I have actually 2 of the 4 books in front of me are both different copies of Wuthering Heights.
Nice.
I think I own 5 at this point. When I was creating this piece, I was thinking very much about liminal spaces and about the border between what is inside and what is outside. Liminal is one of my favorite words.
It's a very grad school word. I also love it.
I love it so much. It's the in-between spaces, the line between one thing and another, and dwelling inside that is something that fascinates me. So in terms of a domestic space, the liminal is the window, right? It's this like barrier that keeps the inside from the outside. And focusing on the liminal, the window, the difference between inside, which is safe, but it is confined, and outside, which is dangerous, but is free, which is very much kind of I think that description fits every single Gothic novel and every Gothic heroine's relationship to inside versus outside. Inside is terrifying, but safe, and outside is dangerous, but wondrous. There's this both and the window. So much happens at the window in Gothic novels. In Mysteries of Udolpho, many scenes feature Emily St. Aubert at her casement, looking out on the walls of Udolpho, watching what might be a ghost walking along those walls. And she goes to the window and she comes away and she goes to it, and she is drawn to what is out there, but also terrified of it. Wuthering Heights obviously has a very famous scene involving a window, which involves the narrator at the window hearing tapping and scratching. This time I remembered I was lying in the oak closet, and I heard distinctly the gusty wind and the driving of the snow. I heard also the fir bough repeat its teasing sound, and ascribed it to the right cause, but annoyed me so much that I resolved to silence it if possible, and I rose and endeavored to unhasp the casement. There's that word again. The hook was soldered into the staple, a circumstance observed by me when awake but forgotten. I must stop it nevertheless, I muttered, knocking my knuckles through the glass and stretching an arm out to seize the unfortunate branch, instead of which my fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand.
Spooky.
So spooky. So in that moment, he is thrusting through the liminal space. This desperation to know, to solve the unknowable problem, causes him to break through that liminal space. And similar to that, in my piece, I was exploring both how that liminal space can make you feel, how that separation can make you feel, but then also how that space, the liminal, can so easily be dissolved and moved through. And when you break through, there is terror and fear and awe and release.
Yeah, windows and doors, right? They're so easy to open, easy to break. So it's a very thin illusion of safety. I like what you're pointing to there. And I like the way that this comes through in your piece. So let's give the viewers a chance to watch this piece. Jacqueline, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That was so beautiful and gauzy, but dark within its lightness. Just really a fascinating piece. And I see what you did there with the tapping on the window. I see it. Yeah. Yeah. And your manicure looks great. So
thank you. Yeah, I specifically chose nails that were too absurdly long to do anything with. Because I really wanted to emphasize that, for me anyway, the thinness of the nail and the sharpness of the nail, it's delicate, but it's dangerous, which is also very Gothic.
That's very Gothic, yeah. Both Gothic and goth at the same time, which I think describes you pretty accurately. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge about the Gothic novel with us. I know that this is a particular passion of yours and fits in with some areas of study. And secretly, I really hope you choose to write something about your reading of disability and the Gothics. I think it's so fascinating. But before we leave you today, I do have one more question for you. Since this conversation was so much about ideas of space, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of your favorite Gothic spaces that you can access in the world as it is today, whether those are unusual spaces we don't think of as the Gothic or just like your favorite castle that you visited. I would love to hear some of your thoughts on Gothic spaces.
Absolutely. So I have been lucky enough to travel to some pretty wonderful places. I'd say the two places I have traveled to that most immediately put me in mind of the Gothic were in the Irish countryside. There are some marvelous castles that are falling to ruins that you can explore. I went to kiss the Blarney Stone, and that is in a beautiful crumbling down castle, so much so that I was a little bit terrified it would crumble right underneath me as I was leaning back to kiss the Blarney Stone. I also have been to Iceland multiple times, and if there's a word that describes the Icelandic landscape, it is sublime. It is a land of extreme opposites, and terrifying and beautiful in the way that they meet. Intense cold and the intense heat of a volcano right next to each other. Beautiful mossy green grass that is grown over top of volcanic rock. All of those opposites, meet in this beautiful liminal space called Iceland. But the Gothic space that I've been exploring that is close to home is actually the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I am from Maryland and living here now. And my husband and I have taken several trips out to the Eastern Shore to spend time by the water. And I noticed one time when I was there that there's these vast expanses of marsh where you can't quite see what is stable ground and what is not. The reeds and things grow up everywhere, and you can't see exactly where the land begins and ends, which means that anytime you move forward, you could sink, which is such a beautiful and terrifying thought, that you don't know where you're safe or not. You don't know where you're in danger. The space itself is also very desolate. The marsh is just flat. So it goes on for miles and miles and miles. And every now and then there'll be like a crabby, crooked tree that comes up out of the endless flatness. And many, many houses out there are falling to pieces and abandoned. I was so inspired by my recent trip out to this landscape that I started wondering, I wonder if people have written Eastern Shore Gothic novels, because I bet those would be really enriching. And I couldn't find any. And so now I'm going to try to write one.
That's great. I feel like that you've found a particular niche right? We're just going to start doing new national versions of the Gothic. So obviously, when you pitch it, you're like, it's Mexican Gothic, but in Maryland.
Exactly.
There it is. So please, that's free for your book pitch. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us so much about your work, and also giving us a peek at the novel you're working on. Love that too. This is actually the final episode of this season of Ekphrasis, so we hope that you'll join us again once we put together our roster for the next season. It has been a wonderful time that we've had with all of our guests this season to chat about some of the things that they're reading and the work that they're creating based on that. So you could always like and subscribe below, and that will give you updates immediately into your YouTube feed about all of the work that we're doing. And if you want to check out more of Jacqueline's work, her website is missdisabilities.com. So we will spell that out for you. But that's where you'll find out more about performances that she's doing in the virtual space, some of her producing work with Out of the Box Productions. And you can also follow her on Facebook and Instagram. And maybe do you have a Patreon or anything?
I don't, but I have just created a new website for my teaching endeavors.
Oh, great.
Which I would love for people to visit. It's called essentialtees.com. Myself and a group of other performers are teaching burlesque that is accessible, that is magical, that is about accessing your power. And I would love for people to join me on that mission.
That's great. So we'll post those links in the video description for you as well, so you can check out more of Jacqueline's work. Thank you so much for joining us. And Jacqueline, thank you. Bye.
Thanks for watching Ekphrasis, a production of Novelties Theater. If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to make a tax-deductible donation through the link in the video description. And don't forget to like and subscribe below so you'll be the first to know when Season 2 launches.